317 species voted to erase humanity from the galaxy, and I watched every single one of them do it. 4 abstained, 0 voted in our favor. The numbers burned themselves into the holographic display above the grand chamber, hanging there in pale blue light like a death sentence written across the sky. And when the final tally locked in place, when every delegate in that enormous room turned to look at the lone human standing at the smallest podium on the lowest tier, I did something none of them expected. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I had already sent the signal 40 seconds before the last vote was cast, and everything that was about to happen to this galaxy was now entirely out of my hands. My name is Lucy Grant. I was the last appointed ambassador from Earth to the Galactic Council, former pilot, reluctant diplomat, and the woman who stood alone in a room full of civilizations that wanted my species gone. This is the record of what happened. I am writing it down because the galaxy has a long habit of forgetting inconvenient truths, and I will not let them forget this one. But I need to go back, not far. 6 months before the vote, before I understood what we were really facing, before I knew what the word sanction actually meant when the Council used it. 6 months before I learned that the most dangerous thing in the universe is not a weapon or a fleet or a species with sharp teeth and fast ships. It is a room full of powerful creatures who have convinced themselves that what they are about to do is perfectly reasonable. It started with an accusation. The Dravine hegemony filed a formal charge against Earth on the 41st anniversary of First Contact. The Dravine were one of the 5 founding species of the Galactic Council, a reptilian empire that had controlled interstellar commerce for over 3,000 years. They were old, powerful, patient, and deeply invested in making sure the galaxy's economy ran through their hands and nobody else's. The charge they filed was a violation of Galactic Statute 1107, which prohibited the unsanctioned development of what the statute called dimensional breach technology. The claim was that our experimental faster-than-light drive, a system our physicist Helen Cross had spent 20 years developing and refining, was tearing holes in the dimensional fabric of shared space and threatening the safety of every species in the galaxy. I knew the charge was nonsense the moment I read it. Our drive did not breach dimensions. It compressed local spacetime around a vessel, allowing it to move faster than light without technically exceeding light speed within its own reference frame. The physics were elegant, tested thoroughly, and entirely safe. I had the data. I had the simulations. I had the mathematical proofs. I had testimony from Helen herself, who could explain the difference between dimensional breach and spacetime compression in language simple enough for a child to follow and detailed enough to satisfy the most rigorous scientist in the galaxy. But the Dravine did not care about physics. They cared about money and the power that money built. Every species that wanted to move cargo, people, or information between star systems paid the Dravine for the privilege. It was the bedrock of their empire, the source of their wealth, and one of the main pillars holding up their position as a founding species of the Council. And humanity, a species they had dismissed as irrelevant since the day we first showed up at their doorstep 40 years ago, had just figured out how to travel between stars without using a single Dravine gate, not just for military ships, for commercial vessels, for colony transports, for anyone, And we had done it cheaply. That was the real crime. Not that we had built something dangerous, but that we had built something that made the Dravine less necessary. In a galaxy run by dependency, making yourself unnecessary to the powerful is the most dangerous thing you can do. I was given 72 hours to prepare a defense, 72 hours to challenge a charge that had been months in the making, backed by the resources of an empire that had been practicing galactic politics since before humans had figured out agriculture. Earth could not afford council-certified legal advocates. Their fees alone would have consumed a third of our annual colonial budget, and the certification process ensured that every approved advocate had deep ties to one founding species or another. The system was designed to make sure that anyone standing trial at the council was represented by someone who ultimately answered to the people running the trial. So I argued the case myself. I stood at the smallest podium in the tribunal chamber, on the lowest tier, with nothing but a datapad and whatever composure I could hold together, under the collective gaze of 321 alien delegations who were watching a single human try to talk her way out of a trap that had been built before she ever walked into the room. I presented the physics. I showed them Helen's simulations, rendered in three-dimensional projections that mapped every interaction between our drive and the surrounding space-time environment. I explained, step by step, that our technology operated on entirely different principles than the dimensional breach systems the statute was written to prevent. I offered to allow independent scientists from any species to inspect our research, visit our laboratories, and run their own tests. I offered full transparency, total access, and complete cooperation. The three presiding judges listened with the polished attentiveness of people who had decided the outcome before I started speaking. Two of them were from founding species. The lead judge was Dravine. I watched their faces as I talked, and I saw nothing change. Not a flicker of doubt, not a moment of hesitation, not the smallest sign that anything I was saying had penetrated the wall of preordained conclusion they had built around themselves. The verdict came down in less than an hour after I finished. Guilty on all counts. Full civilizational sanction meant the complete and permanent revocation of Earth's provisional membership in the Galactic Council. It meant the forced redistribution of our three colony worlds, homes to over 4 million people, to neighboring species that had filed claims on them. It meant the seizure of all our faster-than-light research, every prototype, every dataset, every theoretical model, every line of code. And it meant the permanent confinement of the entire human species to our home solar system. No travel beyond our own star. No trade with other species. No communication with the broader galaxy. A cage built of empty space and enforced by the combined authority of the most powerful civilizations in existence. Every single one of the 321 member species had to cast a ballot, and the vote needed a simple majority to pass. That vote was not scheduled for another 6 months. I left the tribunal chamber and walked the long corridors of the council station back to my quarters. The station was enormous, a habitat ring the size of a city, spinning slowly around a gravitational anchor in deep space. Species of every conceivable shape and biology moved through its hallways. Beings that breathed methane, creatures made of crystallized light, intelligences that existed as patterns of electromagnetic force, drifting through specially designed corridors like thoughts looking for a brain. I walked past all of them, and not one of them met my eyes. I reached my quarters, locked the door, sat down at my personal terminal, and opened an encrypted channel. It used a frequency buried so deep in our communication architecture that even our own diplomatic staff did not know it existed. I had been given this channel on my very first day as ambassador by a woman named Grace Kingsley, who headed Earth's Deep Strategic Planning Division. Grace had a face like weathered stone, and eyes that looked at you as if she were calculating trajectories. I added, 6 months. I sent it. The response came 11 minutes later. 2 words from Grace Kingsley, transmitted from a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star on the far side of the galaxy. We know. That was all. No panic, no confusion, no follow-up questions. Just a calm acknowledgement, as if the pending destruction of everything our species had ever built was a scenario they had already gamed out, planned for, and filed away in a drawer marked when, not if. Those 2 words told me more about what Earth had been doing for the past 40 years than any briefing document ever could. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my terminal and read the full text of the civilizational sanction, every clause, every sub-paragraph, every procedural footnote, and historical annotation. I read it the way a pilot reads terrain before a flight through hostile space, looking for the features that could save you and the ones that could end you. And somewhere deep in the dense legal architecture of Article 7, buried in a section about transitional protocols for sanctioned species that nobody had probably referenced in 9,000 years, I found something. A small thing, a procedural right, a single paragraph that granted a provisionally sanctioned species the ability to request a 30-day grace period for the orderly transition of sovereign responsibilities. 30 days. It was nothing. It changed absolutely nothing about the outcome of the sanction. But it was mine to claim, and I intended to claim it at exactly the right moment. I saved the reference, encrypted it under 3 layers of security, and filed it in a location that nobody would think to search. Then I poured myself a glass of water, drank it slowly, while looking out the viewport at a galaxy full of stars that had just declared my species unwelcome, and began planning for the 6 months ahead of me. The next morning, I started doing something nobody on that station expected from a species that had just been condemned. I started knocking on doors. The first thing I needed to understand was the true architecture of power on the Council. I had known the basics since my first year as ambassador. Everyone knew that the 5 founding species controlled the real levers. The Dravine hegemony controlled trade and transportation through their gate network. The Varesi communion, an ancient hive mind that had existed for 4 billion years and communicated through a form of collective consciousness that most species found deeply unsettling, controlled the flow of information and maintained the historical archives. The Elori Ascending managed all scientific and technological regulation, deciding which species could develop what technologies and at what pace. The Kreth Directorate oversaw military coordination and security operations, and the Hollow Engineers, a machine intelligence so ancient that no living species remembered what their original biological creators had looked like, maintained the physical infrastructure on which the entire council depended, including the station I was living on. 5 species at the top, 316 beneath them, and the distance between those 2 tiers was not measured in prestige or respect. It was measured in dependency. About 200 of the Council's member species were client states of one founder or another. They depended on Dravine gates for their trade. They used Elori-approved technologies in their industries because developing their own was either prohibited or prohibitively regulated. They lived on stations and habitats built and maintained by the Hollow Engineers. Their security was guaranteed by the Kreth, which meant their sovereignty was conditional on Kreth approval. These species did not vote according to their own judgment. They voted the way their patrons instructed them to vote. And their patrons had already decided what the vote on humanity would be. I spent my first 2 months mapping this web of control. I stayed up late every night in my quarters, cross-referencing trade agreements, technology licenses, military pacts, resource allocation records, and economic dependency reports. I built a picture of the galaxy that looked less like a cooperative council of equals and more like a carefully designed machine, a machine built over millennia to keep 5 species in absolute control while giving everyone else the comforting illusion of participation. Then I started looking for cracks in the machine. The Talesi were my first real approach. They were an aquatic species, beautiful and intelligent, who had once built a trading civilization that rivaled the Dravine in scale. That was centuries ago, before the Dravine had systematically dismantled their trade routes, bought out their partners, and locked them into a series of dependency agreements that left them unable to move a single cargo pod between star systems without Dravine permission. The Talesi knew exactly what the Dravine were, and they hated every moment of their dependence. I met with a Talesi trade delegate named Orine in a small establishment on the station's lower commerce ring, where the security monitoring was older and riddled with blind spots. Orine was striking in the way deep ocean creatures are striking, all flowing translucent limbs and bioluminescent patterns that shifted color with her emotional state. When she was calm, she glowed a soft, warm amber. When she was thinking hard, quick pulses of silver ran along her arms. And when she was afraid, she dimmed to a deep, muted blue. She listened to everything I had to say with careful attention. I laid out the case against the sanction, the politics behind it, the Dravine's real motivations. I asked for her support. Not a public declaration, just a quiet vote against the sanction when the time came. One vote, cast in the privacy of the Council's voting system, where no one would know which way the Talesi had gone. When I finished, her patterns dimmed to that sad, deep blue, and she said something I have never forgotten. "Lucy," she said, "I agree with everything you have told me. The charge against your species is invented. The sanction is a tool for the Dravine to protect their monopoly, and if I could vote against it without my people paying the price, I would do it without hesitation." She paused, and her light flickered in a pattern I had learned meant shame. But the Dravine controls 60% of our supply routes. If we vote against the sanction, they will know. The voting system is private in theory, but the Dravine have ways. They always have ways. And they will close our trade routes within a day. My people will face shortages within a week, and real suffering within a month. I have children. I cannot trade their safety for your principles, no matter how right those principles are. She looked at me, and I saw real pain in those luminous eyes. We will vote against you, she said quietly, and I am sorry. I thanked her. I did not argue. I understood her position completely, and I respected her honesty more than I could express. But I walked away from that meeting with a cold, sharp understanding that settled into my chest like a blade made of ice. The vote was not going to be close. It was going to be unanimous, or near enough to make no difference. Not because the galaxy believed Earth was guilty, but because the galaxy was too afraid of the consequences of saying Earth was innocent. The Mokrin were next. They were an insectoid species, brilliant engineers whose technical skills were respected across the galaxy. The Mokrin had helped humanity build our first orbital habitats 40 years ago, and many of them held genuine affection for our species. An elderly Mokrin engineer named Chirik, who had personally designed the structural framework of Earth's first deep space station, agreed to meet me in his private quarters on the station. Chirik was old. His carapace, once a bright coppery sheen, had faded to a dull bronze. His movements were slower than they had once been, but his compound eyes were still sharp, and the mind behind them was still faster than most. "You are here looking for votes," he said, before I had even taken my seat. "I am looking for anything," I told him. There was no point in pretending otherwise with Chirik. He had known humans for longer than most council members had known we existed. He made a series of clicking sounds, the Mokrin equivalent of a long, weary sigh. "You will not find votes, Ambassador. The founders have locked them in. Every species that depends on Dravine trade, Elori technology, Kreth security, or hollow infrastructure has already been contacted. They have been reminded of their obligations and informed of what they stand to lose if they step out of line. The vote is already decided. The ceremony in 6 months is just the performance, a show for the records." "Then what am I supposed to do?" I asked him. He looked at me for a long, silent moment, and I saw something in those old, faceted eyes that made my stomach tighten. It was the look of someone who knows something terrible and is deciding whether to share it. "You prepare for what comes after," he said quietly, "because what comes after the vote is far worse than the vote itself." That was the moment I began to suspect that the civilizational sanction was not what it appeared to be. On paper, it was confinement to a single star system. Harsh, yes. Humiliating, certainly. But survivable. Humanity had lived in one solar system for its entire history before first contact. We could do it again. We would lose our colonies, our research, our connections to the wider galaxy. But we would endure. Humans are remarkably good at enduring. So why did Chirik look at me like he was watching someone walk off the edge of a cliff they could not see? The answer came from the Surathi archive. The Surathi were unlike any other species in the galaxy. They were living libraries, beings whose entire biology and culture revolved around the acquisition, preservation, and transmission of knowledge. They served as the Council's official record keepers, and their neutrality was guaranteed by a charter older than most civilizations in the galaxy. They did not vote. They did not take sides. They did not interfere. They observed, and they remembered. I had not planned to approach the Surathi. They were untouchable by design, and any attempt to influence them would be treated as a violation serious enough to make my situation even worse than it already was. But one of them came to me. His name was Velen. He found me late one evening in the station's public observatory, a vast transparent dome on the station's upper ring where you could stand and look out at the galactic core, a swirl of light so dense it looked like someone had spilled 1 billion candles across the dark. I was alone, standing at the viewport, watching a distant nebula burn in colors I did not have names for, when I heard footsteps behind me. Velen was tall and thin, with skin that looked like polished granite, and eyes that held a quality I found deeply unsettling. They were old eyes, not old the way Chirik's were old, worn down by decades of living. Old the way mountains are old the way the bedrock of a planet is old. They looked at me from across a vast distance, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that the distance was not spatial but temporal. He was looking at me from somewhere very far away in time. "Ambassador Grant," he said. His voice was quiet, precise, and completely neutral. "I am not permitted to assist you. My charter forbids it. But I am permitted to share historical records that are part of the public archive and available to any council member upon request." He held out a small data chip, no bigger than my thumbnail. "What is this?" I asked. "The complete record of every civilizational sanction the Galactic Council has ever imposed," he said. "There have been 11. I took the chip. It was cool and smooth in my hand, and it weighed almost nothing. "What happened to the species that were sanctioned?" I asked, even though something in my gut already knew. Velen looked at me with those ancient, bottomless eyes, and I saw something in them that I never expected to see from a being who was bound by neutrality and charter and 10,000 years of professional detachment. I saw grief. "Read the records, Ambassador," he said. "Then you will understand what you are truly facing." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty observatory, and I stood there, holding a chip that contained the deaths of 11 worlds. I went back to my quarters and read through the night. The records were meticulous. The Surathi did not editorialize, did not interpret, did not draw conclusions. They simply recorded facts, dates, actions, and outcomes with the dispassionate precision of a machine counting seconds. There had been 11 civilizational sanctions in the history of the Galactic Council. 11 species, spread across millions of years of galactic history, had been found guilty of one transgression or another. Some had developed technologies that the founders considered threatening. Some had attempted to build alliances outside the Council's framework. Some had simply grown too large, too fast, too ambitious for the founders' comfort. Each had been tried, convicted, and sanctioned. Each had been confined to its home system, stripped of advanced technology, and placed under what the records called stabilization monitoring. And every single one of those 11 species was gone. Not relocated, not reduced, not absorbed into another civilization. Gone, extinct, erased from the galaxy as completely as if they had never drawn breath, never built a city, never looked up at their own sky and wondered what was out there. The records traced the pattern with terrible clarity. Each sanctioned species followed the same trajectory. First, the confinement. Then, within one generation, a series of internal crises would emerge. Resource shortages that appeared without explanation, political fractures that erupted from nowhere, cultural collapses that seemed to come from within the species itself, but always coincided precisely with the monitoring period. By the third generation, every sanctioned species had ceased to exist. Some were recorded as having destroyed themselves through civil conflict. Some were recorded as having simply declined, their population dropping year after year until there was no one left. Some just stopped appearing in the records entirely, with no explanation, no final entry, no acknowledgement that they had ever been there at all. 11 species, 11 quiet endings, and in the millions of years that the Council had existed, not a single other member species had ever formally questioned what had happened to any of them. I sat at my terminal as the station's artificial dawn began to brighten outside my viewport, painting the walls of my quarters in shades of pale gold, and I understood with absolute, bone-deep clarity what old Chirrut had been trying to tell me. The civilizational sanction was not a punishment. It was an execution, patient, methodical, and wrapped in so many layers of procedure and legal language that every species in the galaxy could tell itself the outcome was natural, inevitable, just the way things go when a species is not ready for the galactic stage. The Council was not going to cage humanity. They were going to end us, slowly, carefully, with full deniability, and with the silent, comfortable consent of 321 species who would never have to look directly at what they had helped to do. I closed the files. I stood up. I walked to my viewport and pressed my hand flat against the cool, transparent surface, looking out at the galaxy, that impossible sprawl of light and dust and distance, billions upon billions of stars burning in the dark, and I felt something shift inside me. A weight settled into my bones, not despair, something heavier and far more useful. The fear was still there, but underneath it, a foundation was being poured, hard and deep, and I knew it would hold. I opened the encrypted channel and sent a message to Earth. It was longer than my first. The sanction is not confinement, it is extinction. 11 species before us, all of them dead. The Council has done this before, and they intend to do it again. Whatever the ghosts are, whatever you have been building for 40 years, it needs to be ready in 4 months. Not 6, 4. Because I need the last 2 months to do something that nobody in this galaxy will see coming. Grace Kingsley's response arrived in 19 minutes. One word. Understood. I did not know what the ghosts were, not the details. I knew only that on my first day as ambassador, Grace had told me that Earth had been preparing for worst-case scenarios since the very first hour of first contact. She said that the first human delegation to visit the Council station had looked at the galaxy's power structure and seen what everyone else had learned to ignore. That the Council was not a community of equals. It was a hierarchy, maintained by control and dependency, and every species that had ever found itself at the bottom of that hierarchy had eventually disappeared. So they started building, quietly, carefully, in places no one would look. I did not know what they had built, how many people were involved, or how far the preparations extended. I only knew that when I had sent that first signal, Grace Kingsley had responded with, "We know." Not, "We will start preparing." Not, "What are our options?" Just, "We know." The calm, unhurried acknowledgement of people who had spent 4 decades getting ready for exactly this moment. I spent the next 4 months living 2 lives at once. In public, I continued my diplomatic campaign. I met with species after species, making my case, presenting evidence, asking for support. I went to every reception, attended every committee session, responded to every invitation with grace and professionalism. I knew I would not change a single vote. That was not the point. The point was to be visible. The point was to make every species in the galaxy watch the lone human ambassador walk from door to door, make her case with dignity and reason, and be turned away each time. I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to remember it later. I wanted them to think about it when everything changed, and ask themselves whether they might have made a different choice. In private, I prepared. I studied the Council's charter until I could recite entire sections from memory. I memorized procedures, precedents, and protocols that had gathered dust for millennia. I returned to Article 7 and studied every legal interpretation that existed in the Sarathi records. I mapped out a plan so precise that its success depended on timing measured in single seconds, and I rehearsed it in my quarters every night until I could execute it without conscious thought. And I waited for the ghosts to tell me they were ready. The message came with exactly 2 months to spare. It arrived on the encrypted channel, not from Grace Kingsley this time, but from a voice I had never heard before. A woman's voice. Calm and steady and unmistakably human, with the particular kind of composure that comes from years of training for moments that cannot be rehearsed. Ambassador Grant, we are in position. All elements confirmed. How many? I asked. There was a pause. 3 seconds of silence on a channel that spanned half the galaxy. Then the voice said a number. I sat down. My legs made the decision for me. I sat in my chair and stared at the wall of my quarters and tried to fit the number I had just heard into the picture of humanity that the galaxy believed was complete. 12 frigates, 3 colony worlds, 1 ambassador on the lowest tier. And behind all of that, hidden in the dark spaces where no one had thought to look, something so much larger that the mind struggled to hold it. That is enough, I said, when I could speak again. That is more than enough. The vote was in 60 days. I had done everything I could. The allies I had failed to win, the secrets I had uncovered, the plan I had assembled, piece by piece, in the quiet hours between meetings with species who smiled at me with practiced sincerity and lied to my face with practiced skill. All of it was converging on one moment, one room, one podium, where I would stand alone and face a galaxy that had already decided I did not deserve to exist. I was ready, and for the first time in 6 months, I slept through the night without waking. The Grand Deliberation Chamber was the largest enclosed space I had ever entered. It was built into an artificial planetoid at the galactic core, a structure so vast that it had its own atmospheric systems. Clouds formed near the ceiling, nearly 2 kilometers above the chamber floor, and during long sessions it sometimes rained. The delegates had jokes about it, complaints about which species' podiums got wet, old stories about legendary sessions that lasted long enough for storms to form. Today, the air was clear and still, and the light from the chamber's artificial sun fell across 321 podiums, arranged in concentric rings that rose from the floor like the tiers of an amphitheater, designed for the gods of 100 different worlds. Each podium was engineered for the specific needs of the species it hosted. Some were filled with water, some were pressurized chambers containing atmospheres of methane, ammonia, or gases I did not have names for. Some were simply platforms of shaped light for beings that had no physical forms. Some were massive, built to support the weight of species that massed more than a shuttle. Some were so small they held only a single delegate. At the very center, raised above everything else, sat the 5 podiums of the founding species, each one carved from materials that predated most of the stars visible from the chamber's viewports. My podium was at the outermost ring, the lowest tier, the position reserved for provisional members, minor species, petitioners, and civilizations the Council had not yet decided were worth listening to. I had stood on that platform for 3 years, looking up at the rings above me, watching the real business of the galaxy get conducted in conversations I was not part of, and decisions I was not consulted on. Today, for the very last time, I climbed the 3 steps to the platform, placed my hands on the railing, and looked out at the assembled galaxy. Every species was present. The chamber was full in a way it rarely was. Some delegations had sent their most senior diplomats. Others had sent representatives who looked like they wanted to get through this quickly and move on to more interesting matters. The Dravine occupied their founder's podium with the languid confidence of an apex predator settling into its favorite spot. Their scaled faces showed nothing, their postures communicating the specific kind of boredom that is itself a display of power. The Varesi communion pulsed softly in their sealed environmental pod, millions of interconnected minds observing through a single interface, ancient beyond comprehension, and apparently content to watch one more small species be processed and filed away. Council Speaker Dothrin, a Kreth official with the bearing of a career bureaucrat who had risen as high as a non-founder could rise, called the session to order. His voice was amplified through the chamber's acoustic systems until it filled the enormous space the way a bell fills a cathedral, resonant and inescapable. The matter before this council is the ratification of Civilizational Sanction Order 12, pertaining to the species designated as human, homeworld designation Earth, Sol System, Orion Arm. The tribunal has rendered its verdict. The council will now vote to ratify or reject the recommended sanction. Each member species will cast 1 vote. A simple majority is required for ratification. He turned and looked directly at me. His expression was neutral, professional, faintly sympathetic in the way that a doctor is sympathetic when delivering a diagnosis that cannot be changed. Ambassador Grant, do you wish to make a statement before the vote? I had prepared a statement. I had spent a week writing it, another week revising it, and 3 nights rehearsing it, until every word sat exactly where I wanted it. It was dignified, measured, and carefully argued. It presented, one final time, all the reasons why the charge against Earth was false, and the sanction was unjust. It was the best speech I had ever written. I abandoned it. No, I said, I will speak after the vote. The ripple of surprise that moved through the chamber was subtle, but unmistakable. Every previously sanctioned species had spoken before the vote. Every single one had used that final opportunity to plead their case, to argue, to appeal to the conscience of the council, to beg for mercy with whatever dignity they could maintain. It was expected, it was tradition, it was the script that everyone in this room had already written me into. I was not going to follow the script. The speaker paused for half a second, then nodded and began the roll call. Each species was named in order of seniority, starting with the founders. Each would cast their vote, and each vote would appear on the holographic display above the chamber, building a column of light that tracked the running tally for all to see. The Dravine hegemony voted yes. Their delegates spoke the word without inflection, as if confirming a lunch order. The Varesi communion voted yes. 4 billion years of accumulated wisdom, and they spent it on silence and compliance. The Ellerai Ascending voted yes. The Kreth Directorate voted yes. The Hollow Engineers, who communicated through modulated electromagnetic pulses that the translation system rendered as flat, toneless words, voted yes. All 5 founders, unanimous. The roll call moved to the general membership, and I stood at my podium and watched the column of light grow. Name by name, species by species, each one adding their voice to a chorus of condemnation that grew louder with every count. I watched the Talesi cast their vote. Across the chamber, I could see Orine's bioluminescent patterns cycling through rapid, agitated pulses of blue and silver as she confirmed the word. Yes, she did not look at me. She could not. I watched the Makrin cast their vote. He had been right. I watched species I had visited, species I had reasoned with, species I had shared meals with and exchanged gifts with, and spent long evenings talking with, about everything from art to astrophysics. I watched species that had told me privately that they believed Earth was innocent, that the Dravines case was fabricated, that the sanction was a miscarriage of every principle the Council claimed to stand for. I watched every single one of them vote yes. The tally climbed. 100, 150, 200, 250, 300. At 300, a handful of species abstained, 4 of them, small civilizations from the outer rim, too remote, and too insignificant to be under any founder's thumb, too minor for their votes to matter one way or another. Their abstentions were recorded, and immediately forgotten. The final count appeared on the display, 317 in favor, 4 abstentions, 0 opposed. The process was complete. Every procedure had been observed. Every rule had been followed. The galaxy, speaking through its duly constituted governing body, had declared with near total unanimity that the human species was to be stripped, confined, and subjected to the same quiet process of managed extinction that had ended 11 civilizations before ours. Speaker Dothran cleared his throat and turned to face me. Ambassador Grant, you indicated that you wish to address the Council following the vote. The floor is yours. Many of them had already begun gathering their materials, organizing their notes, preparing to leave. The human question was settled. The next item on the agenda was something about resource allocation in the middle sectors. Life goes on, even when yours is scheduled to end. "Thank you, Speaker Dothran," I said. My voice carried through the acoustic systems clearly and evenly, and I was proud of that, because keeping it steady required every scrap of training I had ever received. "I will be brief." I let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. Three, long enough to make delegates who were already mentally composing their dinner plans look up from their notes. Long enough to make the room pay attention. We have learned about your technologies, your cultures, your philosophies, and your laws. We have learned how decisions are made in this chamber. We have learned what this institution was built to protect, and what it was built to do to those it chooses not to protect. I let that sit for a moment. I would like to read something into the official record. 11 names. The names of species that stood where I am standing now, at this same podium, on this same tier. Species that were charged, tried, sanctioned, and voted against. Exactly as Earth has been today. The quality of the silence changed. giving each one space and weight. Most of the delegates in the chamber had never heard these names before. The species they belonged to had been so thoroughly erased from galactic consciousness that they existed only in the deepest archives, in records that no one ever requested and no one ever reviewed. I spoke each name as if it mattered, because it did, and I watched the reactions cascade through the tiers of the chamber, like ripples moving outward from a stone dropped into still water. In the Surathi delegation's enclosure, I saw Velen standing at the back. His ancient eyes were closed. These 11 species were sanctioned by this council, I continued. Each of them accepted the ruling. Each of them complied with every term. They surrendered their technology. They submitted to monitoring. They did everything they were told to do. And within 3 generations, every single one of them ceased to exist. Not because they failed, not because they were weak, but because the system that sanctioned them was designed to produce exactly that outcome. The complete records, not the summaries that general membership is given access to. I know what happened to those 11 species. I know how it was done. And I know that every species sitting in this chamber today either knows the truth already or has chosen very carefully not to learn it. The silence in the chamber was total. I could feel it pressing against my skin like a physical thing. Earth accepts the ruling of this council, I said. We will comply with the terms of the sanction as ratified today. But I want it understood, and I want it recorded, that you were not deceived. You were not given incomplete information. You saw the charge. You heard the evidence. You had access to the history, if you had ever bothered to look at it, and you voted yes. Every single one of you. Not because you believed it was right, but because it was easier than standing up. Then, without changing my expression or my posture, I shifted direction. He turned to his legal advisors, who looked confused. The advisors consulted their records. Several minutes passed while they searched through the archives, digging through layers of procedure that had been dormant for so long they were practically fossilized. They found Article 7 eventually. It granted a provisionally sanctioned species the right to request a 30-day grace period for the orderly transition of sovereign responsibilities. A formality. A vestige from an era when sanctioned species still had responsibilities complex enough to require an organized handover. In practice, it meant nothing. It delayed the enforcement by 1 month. It changed not a single aspect of the outcome. The speaker granted it with a wave of his manipulating appendage. 30 days. So noted. I walked across the vast floor of the grand deliberation chamber, my footsteps the only sound in a room built to hold the voices of galaxies. I walked past delegations that watched me go, with faces that held pity, contempt, indifference, and, in a few cases, something that might have been guilt, if any of them had the courage to let themselves feel it. I reached the corridor outside the chamber. I walked until I was alone. Then I stopped, leaned against the wall, pressed my hand against the communicator on my wrist, and tapped a code on a frequency that had no business existing on Council communication infrastructure. A voice answered. Human, female, the same steady voice I had heard 2 months ago when the ghosts reported their readiness. Ambassador, we monitored the entire session, 317 to 0. Yes, I said. My voice was steady. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. The 30-day window? Granted. Starting now. Then we begin. Day 1. Midnight Galactic Standard. I closed my eyes. How many ships are in position? The voice did not hesitate. More than they can count, Ambassador. More than they thought we could build in a century, let alone 4 decades. I closed the channel and stood there in the empty corridor, listening to the muffled sounds of the council chamber, moving on to its next agenda item through the walls. Shipping regulations in the outer arm. Business as usual. The human question was resolved, filed, forgotten. A minor species, managed and scheduled for a quiet ending. Nothing to dwell on. Pass the agenda. They had no idea what they had just started. I straightened up. I smoothed the front of my uniform. And I walked back toward my quarters with the measured, deliberate stride of someone who knows precisely what is coming and has decided to meet it standing. Day 1. On the first morning of the 30-day grace period, the galaxy discovered that it did not know humanity at all. I was awake and waiting when it happened. I had set my alarm for 30 minutes before midnight, Galactic Standard Time. Not because I needed to be awake for any operational reason. I had no role in what was about to happen. But I wanted to be watching. I wanted to see the feeds. I wanted to observe, in real time, the moment when 321 species learned that the creature they had just voted to put down had teeth they had never imagined. At exactly midnight, 742 vessels appeared simultaneously across 12 sectors of the galaxy. They did not arrive through jump gates. They did not emerge from hyperspace corridors. 1 second, the space was empty. The next, it was full of ships that no sensor network in the galaxy had ever registered before. They materialized on every monitoring system the Council operated, every early warning array, every deep space survey beacon, every military detection grid the Kreth Directorate maintained, 742 contacts, appearing from nothing, as if the universe had been hiding them behind a curtain and had suddenly decided to pull it aside. The ships were not like anything the galaxy recognized. They did not follow LRI design standards. They did not use the hull configurations, propulsion geometries, or structural principles that had been standardized across Council space for millennia. They were dark where Council ships were bright. They moved in formations that no military strategist in the galaxy had ever seen, because those formations were based on tactical doctrines that humanity had developed entirely alone, entirely in secret, over 4 decades of quiet, relentless preparation. Council sensor networks identified them as human in origin, human power signatures, human communication frequencies, human materials. That was the full extent of humanity's known military capability. 12 ships, a rounding error in the Dravine's fleet inventory. Manufacturing platforms, orbital habitats, entire industrial complexes that had been hidden in the empty spaces between star systems, in the gravitational shadows of rogue planets that no species had bothered to catalog. In the dark voids between spiral arms, where there was nothing to see, and therefore no reason to look, humanity had not just built a hidden fleet, they had built a hidden civilization. Hundreds of facilities, thousands of vessels, millions of human beings, living and working and building in places the galaxy had dismissed as empty, useless, not worth surveying. The ghosts. That was what Grace Kingsley had called them 40 years ago, when the first plans were drawn, and the first teams were dispatched into the dark. Not a fleet, not a weapon, a contingency. An entire second version of human civilization, built in parallel to the one the Council knew about, designed to exist in the spaces the galaxy did not watch, growing quietly in the shadows, while the visible version of humanity played the role of a harmless, minor, Class 9 developing species that was not worth worrying about. I watched the Council communication channels catch fire. The sheer volume of traffic on the diplomatic and military frequencies was unlike anything I had seen in 3 years of monitoring them. Panic, disbelief, demands for sensor recalibration, accusations that the readings were spoofed, faked, impossible. The Dravine were loudest, their ambassador insisting in increasingly strained tones that humanity simply could not have constructed anything of this magnitude without being detected by Dravine intelligence services. The Elori demanded to know how human vessels could function without Elori-certified technology. The Hollow engineers ran diagnostics on their own sensor networks, convinced there must be a malfunction. I think they were afraid that I would answer. On day 3, Earth spoke. Not to the Council, to the galaxy. The message was broadcast on every open communication frequency, in every language the translation systems could process, to every species with the technology to receive a signal. It was not a threat. It was not a declaration of hostility. It was not the chest-beating display of aggression that the Kreth Directorate had been bracing for. It was the truth. all 11 civilizational sanctions, all 11 extinctions. The unedited historical record of what the Galactic Council had done, methodically and repeatedly, to species that challenged the Founders' control. Names, dates, methods, and outcomes. Every detail. Nothing omitted. Nothing softened. The accompanying message was plain. The Galactic Council has imposed civilizational sanctions on 12 species. 11 of those species are now extinct. Earth is the 12th. Here is the documented record of what was done to the others. Here is the process that has been set in motion against us, and here is what we are going to do about it. The terms were simple. Any species that voluntarily withdrew from the Council and joined the Compact would receive full, unrestricted access to humanity's faster-than-light drive technology. No cost, no licensing fees, no dependency agreements, no client-state obligations, no strings of any kind. Any species that joined could build their own faster-than-light drives, travel wherever they wanted, trade with whomever they chose, and never pay the Dravine a single credit for the privilege of crossing between star systems ever again. The Founders understood immediately what this meant. If enough species accepted the offer, the entire economic and political infrastructure of the Council would collapse. The Dravine's shipping monopoly, the foundation of their power for 3,000 years, would become worthless overnight. The dependency networks that kept 200 client states voting the way their patrons wanted would dissolve. The system of control that had kept 5 species on top and everyone else beneath them for millennia would simply cease to function. The Council speaker called an emergency session. He demanded that Earth withdraw the Open Compact offer. He cited statutes, regulations, precedents, and charter provisions. He called it economic destabilization, an act of aggression against the stability of galactic civilization. I attended the session from my podium on the lowest tier. I listened to the speaker's demands with the attentive patience of someone who has already won and is simply waiting for the other side to realize it. When he finished, I gave a brief response. Earth is currently under civilizational sanction. Our provisional membership has been revoked. We are no longer members of this council, and therefore no longer bound by its statutes, regulations, or precedents. You removed us from your system 3 days ago. You cannot simultaneously claim that we are outside your authority and demand that we obey your rules. It is one or the other, Speaker Dothrin. You chose. The speaker opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, then closed it and moved on to the next speaker. The legal framework the Council had used to condemn humanity had, by its own internal logic, freed humanity from any obligation to follow Council law. They had built a trap that caught itself. On day 5, the Talisi became the first species to join the Open Compact. The announcement came through official channels, but Orine sent me a private message moments before it went public. It was short. I wanted you to hear it from me first. When I voted against you in that chamber, I was telling the truth about being sorry. But I also want you to know that I have never been more proud of any decision my people have ever made than the one we made this morning. I read her message 3 times. Then I sat quietly for several minutes and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. Not relief, not triumph. Something more complicated than either. Something that felt like watching a locked door swing open after you had spent years believing it was sealed shut forever. The Mokrin followed within 2 days. Then the Selen Reach, a species of nomadic travelers who had been confined to council-approved corridors for centuries. Then the Voshka, then the Denny, then the Urel Compact, then a dozen more, then 2 dozen, then a flood. Within 2 weeks, 47 species had formally withdrawn from the council and signed the Open Compact. The founders' voting majority, the mathematical foundation of their control over galactic governance, was shrinking by the hour. The Dravine response was swift, predictable, and precisely what Earth had expected. They announced that any species joining the Open Compact would be treated as a hostile actor and subjected to immediate military consequences. They mobilized their fleet, the largest single military force in the galaxy, and issued direct ultimatums to every Compact signatory. 3 Compact members were targeted first. The Dravine threw a blockade around the Talesi homeworld, cutting off all incoming and outgoing traffic. 2 Mokrin colonial stations were isolated from their supply networks. The Selen Reach had 3 of their migration vessels intercepted and held in place by Dravine cruisers. The galaxy held its breath and watched. Because everyone understood what was really being tested. Not whether the Dravine could project force. That had never been in question. What was being tested was whether humanity's hidden fleet was real, whether the ghosts were substance or smoke, whether the species that had been sitting at the lowest tier of the Council's hierarchy for 40 years could actually protect the people who had trusted them. I sent one message to the Ghost Fleet Command. The Talesi are blockaded. The Mokrin are cut off. People who believed in us are in danger because they believed in us. Three words. We are moving. but I monitored every communication feed, every sensor relay, every fragment of data that came in from the engagement zone. And what I saw in those data streams over the next 11 hours changed my understanding of what humanity had become during those 40 years in the dark. The engagement lasted 11 hours. Not because the outcome was uncertain, but because the Ghost Fleet was not trying to destroy the Dravine Armada, they were trying to stop it. Not just for travel between star systems, but for tactical movement within the engagement zone itself. Ships appeared inside Dravine formations, disrupted command networks, disabled weapon systems with surgical precision, and then vanished before the Dravine's targeting systems could lock on. Autonomous drone swarms, operating with a level of coordination that made the Dravine's own fleet tactics look primitive by comparison, enveloped Dravine capital ships and methodically stripped away their offensive capabilities without breaching a single hull. Every ship was still functioning. Every crew member was unharmed. But their weapons were offline, their navigation systems were scrambled, and their communications were limited to a single channel that the Ghost Fleet had deliberately left open for one purpose. Catherine Ellis broadcast one message to the disabled fleet. You are free to return to Dravine space. Your personnel are safe. Full system capability will be restored once you have withdrawn from compact territory. This engagement is concluded. There is no need for it to happen again. The Dravine withdrew. That evening, I received a direct communication from the Dravine ambassador. His name was Kelthor, and I had dealt with him for 3 years. He was intelligent, calculating, and possessed of the cold, precise ruthlessness that the Dravine cultivated as a cultural virtue. He had always treated me with a kind of cordial dismissiveness, the way a grown person might treat a child who keeps wandering into important meetings. When his face appeared on my screen, I saw something on it that I had never seen on a Dravine before. His voice was controlled, but something underneath the control was fracturing. How did you build all of this without a single one of our intelligence networks detecting it? I looked at him through the screen. This representative of a 3,000-year empire that had just discovered it was not the most powerful force in the room. This diplomat who had spent his career managing species that he considered beneath notice. This ambassador whose entire worldview had been built on the assumption that the galaxy's hierarchy was permanent, natural, and beyond challenge. You missed it because you never looked, I said. You watched our 12 frigates and our 3 colonies, and our 1 ambassador on the lowest tier, and you decided that was all we were. You put us at the bottom of every list, behind every door, beneath every conversation that mattered, and you never once asked yourself whether the species you were dismissing might be doing something you could not see. 40 years, Kelthor. You had 40 years to learn a single important thing about humanity, and you learned nothing. Not because we were clever, because you were certain you already knew everything worth knowing. I paused. Let the silence do its work. That is not our failure. It is yours. He disconnected without responding. His face disappeared from my screen, and I sat alone in my quarters, on a station built by civilizations that had ruled the stars since before my species learned to write, and I felt the weight of everything that had happened settle around me like armor I had not realized I was putting on. Day 30 arrived, and the galaxy that greeted it was unrecognizable from the one that had existed a month earlier. The council convened again, or what remained of it. Of the 321 species that had sat in the Grand Deliberation Chamber 30 days ago and voted to sanction humanity, only 164 remained. The rest had either joined the Open Compact, declared formal neutrality, or simply stopped responding to council communications. But their majority was gone. The mathematical foundation of their control, the simple arithmetic of having more votes than everyone else, had been demolished in 30 days by an offer that cost Earth nothing and promised the galaxy everything the founders had been withholding for millennia. I stood at my podium on the lowest tier for the last time. The room felt different. The delegates who remained did not look down at me the way they had before. The pity was gone. The contempt was gone. Something else had taken their place, a complicated mix of respect and unease, and the particular kind of wariness that comes from realizing you have been sharing a room with something far more capable than you understood. The session began in disorder. Delegates argued among themselves. The Dravine demanded retaliatory action against the compact. The Kreth called for negotiations. The Elori proposed a suspension of all proceedings. Speaker Dothran tried to maintain order and largely failed. Then the Varesi Communion spoke. The Varesi had not addressed the council in open session for 10,000 years. 10,000 years of watching, recording, pulsing quietly in their sealed environmental pod, casting their votes when required, and otherwise maintaining a silence so absolute and so prolonged that most species had stopped expecting them to ever speak again. Some younger delegates had never heard the Varesi communicate directly. Some had begun to wonder whether the communion was still fully conscious in any way that mattered, or whether it had retreated into some internal process so deep and so alien that the external universe had simply become irrelevant to it. Because the sound of the Varesi communion speaking was unlike anything else in existence. It was not a single voice. It was millions of voices, woven together into a harmonic that resonated at frequencies most species could feel in their bones, and in their teeth, and in the deep structures of their brains, where language had not yet been invented. The translation systems labored for a moment, stuttered, recalibrated, and then delivered the meaning in flat, neutral tones that could not begin to convey the gravity of what was being said. We have observed, for 4 billion years, we have watched 40,000 species emerge from simplicity and reach toward complexity. We have seen civilizations that spanned galaxies dissolve into silence. We have seen patterns repeat across scales of time that most species cannot comprehend. The chamber was frozen. Every delegate, every aide, every observer stood or sat or floated motionless, caught in the web of a voice that had not been heard in living memory for most of the species present. We watched the founders consolidate control. We watched the sanctions. We watched the 11. We said nothing, because we calculated that the cost of disruption would exceed the cost of injustice. We treated suffering as an acceptable variable in an equation optimized for order. something that sounded, impossibly, like admission. We were wrong, not because the system was unjust. We knew it was unjust from the beginning. We were wrong because we assumed that no species would ever be persistent enough, creative enough, or reckless enough to break the system without bringing everything down with it. We looked at the humans, and we saw what everyone else saw. A young species. A small species. A species that surely could not understand the forces they were confronting. Another pause. Not warmth. The Varesi were too alien for anything as simple as warmth. But recognition. The acknowledgement of one intelligence encountering another, and being genuinely surprised. We underestimated them. This is not offered as praise for the humans. It is offered as a confession of our own limitation. 4 billion years of observation, and we could not predict what a sufficiently determined mind will do when every other option has been taken away. The communion fell silent. 10,000 years of silence broken, and then silence again, and the galaxy turned on its axis in the space between those two silences. What followed was not dramatic. It was procedural, which is how the largest changes in civilizations actually happen. Not in a flash of light or a roar of sound, but in the quiet scratching of decisions being recorded, votes being tallied, and old structures being replaced by new ones, one line of text at a time. I raised a motion from my podium, a motion to dissolve the current council charter in its entirety and replace it with the framework of the Open Compact. Under the new framework, no species would hold hereditary authority over any other. Technology would be shared freely, not controlled and rationed. No species could be sanctioned without the unanimous agreement of every member, and any member could leave at any time, for any reason, without penalty or consequence. The hierarchy that had governed the galaxy for longer than most species could remember would be replaced by something simpler and, I hoped, something more honest. A table where everyone sat at the same height. The Telesi seconded the motion. They had returned to the chamber as representatives of the Open Compact, and Orine delivered the second with a voice that was steady and patterns that burned bright gold, the color of conviction. The Makrin supported it. The Selen Reach supported it. 43 other species, many of them former client states who had spent centuries voting the way their patrons told them to, stood on their own podiums and spoke their own words, and cast their own votes, for the first time in their civilization's histories. The vote was called. It was not unanimous. The Dravine voted against it. Of course they did. Accepting the compact would mean surrendering the monopoly that had defined their empire for 3 millennia. The Kreth voted against it, unwilling to give up their role as the galaxy's military authority. A handful of smaller species that still clung to founder patronage voted against or abstained, too afraid of the future to let go of the past. But the motion passed, by a margin so clear that no procedural challenge, no legal objection, no parliamentary maneuver could reverse it. I thought about Orine, who had wept blue light when she voted against us, and burned gold when she voted for the future. I thought about Chirik, who had warned me to prepare for what came after, and who had lived long enough to see that what came after was not the ending he had feared. I thought about Velen, who had bent the sacred neutrality of his species' charter because he believed that some truths are more important than rules, and who stood now in the Sarathi enclosure, with his ancient eyes open and watching. I thought about Grace Kingsley, who had looked at the galaxy 40 years ago and seen the machine for what it was, and who had started building humanity's answer to it before most humans even knew the question existed. I thought about Catherine Ellis and the crews of the Ghost Fleet, who had spent their lives preparing in the dark for a confrontation they hoped would never come, and who had faced it with precision and restraint and a conscious, deliberate refusal to cause more harm than was absolutely necessary. And I thought about the 11, the species whose names I had spoken into the record of a council that had erased them, the ones who had done everything right, who had trusted the system, followed the rules, accepted the rulings, and disappeared into a silence so complete that the galaxy forgot they had ever existed. They were gone. Nothing could bring them back. No vote, no compact, no amount of justice applied to the present could undo what had been done to them in the past. But their names were in the record now. I would make sure of it, and the galaxy that was being built in the wake of the old council's dissolution would be built in part on the foundation of their memory. They would be the reason that no species would ever again stand alone on the lowest tier and beg for its life, while a room full of comfortable powers looked on and did nothing. The session ended. The delegates filed out. The grand deliberation chamber, this colossal space carved into an artificial planet at the heart of the galaxy, emptied slowly until I was the only person remaining. I stood at my podium and looked up at the tiers above me, the rings of vacant platforms where 321 species had once sat and decided the fates of worlds. The holographic displays were dark. The acoustic systems had powered down. High above, the artificial clouds that gathered near the chamber's ceiling were beginning to thin as the environmental systems entered their rest cycle. I took out my personal log, the recording device I had been speaking my thoughts into since the day I was first appointed to this post, and I made my final entry. They voted to erase us, all 317 of them, and when I stood at that podium, I looked out at a room full of ancient civilizations who believed they were making a routine decision, one more minor species, managed and forgotten. They forgot the first rule of the universe: never vote to cage something that has already learned how to build its own door. I closed the log, I put it away, I stepped down from the podium for the last time, and I walked across the empty chamber floor. My footsteps echoed in a space that was designed to hold the voices of galaxies, and now held only the sound of one human walking toward the exit. Catherine Ellis was waiting for me in the corridor outside. She stood straight and still, in a dark uniform I had never seen before. The uniform of a fleet that had existed in secret for 40 years, and had stepped into the light only 30 days ago. She was younger than I had expected. She had calm, steady eyes, and the kind of composure that comes not from arrogance, but from the quiet confidence of someone who has spent years preparing, and knows that the preparation was enough. "Ambassador," she said. "Commander," I replied. She offered a small smile. It was tired, but real, the kind of smile that comes at the end of something enormous, when the adrenaline has faded, and what remains is the simple, human relief of having made it through. "The fleet is standing down across all sectors. Compact signatories are secure. The Dravine have pulled back to their home territories. No further confrontations expected." I looked at her, this woman who had spent her career commanding ships that the galaxy did not know existed, who had trained for decades for a day she had prayed would never arrive, and who had faced it with a philosophy that prioritized restraint over destruction, precision over force, and the preservation of life on both sides of the engagement. "Thank you," I said, "for all of it." She shook her head. "We should be thanking you, Ambassador. You gave us the 30 days. You found the legal framework. You gave us the chance to do this without firing first." "We fired eventually," I said. "We responded," she corrected gently. "And only when people who trusted us were in danger. The galaxy noticed the difference. It matters." "What happens now?" I asked. Catherine looked at me with those steady eyes. "Now we build something better. That was always the plan, Ambassador. Not just to survive, to make sure that no one, anywhere, ever again has to stand at the bottom of a room full of powerful beings and beg for permission to exist." I thought about that. I thought about Orane, who would never again have to choose between her children's safety and her own conscience. I thought about Chirik, who had spent a lifetime watching species be managed and erased, and who had finally lived long enough to see the machine break down. I thought about Velen, who had bent the rules of 10,000 years because he believed that some truths cannot wait for permission. And I thought about myself, years ago, before I was an ambassador, or a pilot, or any of the things this galaxy had required me to become. I thought about a girl lying on her back in the grass behind a small house in a small town on a small planet, looking up at a sky full of stars that were too far away to touch and too beautiful to stop reaching for. She had wondered what was out there, what it would be like to meet the beings that lived among those distant lights, whether they would be kind. Now I knew the answer. Some of them were kind. Some of them were afraid. Some of them were so old and so powerful that they had forgotten what it was like to be small. And some of them, a very few, had the courage to break a 10,000-year silence and say, in front of everyone, "We were wrong." That was enough to build on. It was more than the 11 had ever been given, and I intended to make sure it was the beginning of something worthy. I walked with Catherine Ellis through the corridors of the station, past the sealed doors of delegations that were packing their materials and preparing to return to homeworlds that existed in a galaxy fundamentally different from the one they had left. Past viewports that framed a sky full of stars that were, for the first time in a very long time, a little bit freer than they had been the day before. Behind us, the old order settled quietly into history, its weight already beginning to fade. Ahead of us, the open compact waited to be built, a framework without a hierarchy, a table without a head, an agreement between species that chose to sit together as equals because they had seen, finally and undeniably, what happened when they did not. And somewhere out there, in the vast dark spaces between the stars, where humanity had hidden its real strength for 4 decades, the Ghost Fleet was standing down. Its lights were dimming. Its weapons were going cold. Its purpose, the purpose for which it had been built in secret and maintained in silence and held in reserve through 40 years of patient, grinding, unbearable waiting, had been fulfilled. Not by firing, but by being ready to fire and then choosing not to, and letting that choice speak louder than any weapon ever could. And for the first time since I had opened that encrypted channel 6 months ago and typed the words that started everything, I allowed myself to feel something I had kept locked away behind discipline and training and the cold arithmetic of survival. Hope. Simple, stubborn, human hope. The kind that builds doors where there were none,